Hey guys, tonight we are standing before the world's oldest post office. Its stone walls cold under your fingertips, the damp air of the Scottish hills curling softly around your sleeves. You blink slowly, your eyes adjusting to the dim light, imagining the weight of hundreds of years pressed into the mortar. You inhale and it smells faintly of rain, moss, and yes, old paper and wax. There's something thrilling about this, isn't there? Until you realize you're about to follow the long, uneventful journey of a place that has, frankly, seen more slow days than dramatic ones. You probably won't survive this story wide awake, to be honest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the drizzle outside Sanker Post Office, opened in 1712, making it the world's oldest operational post office. The building is small, charmingly crooked, its slate roof weather-beaten, its whitewashed walls flecked with lichen. You push open the heavy wooden door and step inside. It creaks, the same creak that countless feet have heard, from Georgian mailmen in buckled shoes to modern tourists in rubber boots. Your fingers trail across the countertop. You imagine parchment letters, carefully folded and sealed with wax, sliding across this very surface. Historians still argue whether the very first postmasters here were more like local dignitaries or simple shopkeepers pressed into duty. But what's certain is that the mail they handled wasn't grand. It was ordinary. It's hard to believe, but back then, even basic communication was a luxury. You'd wait weeks for a reply to a letter. A missed delivery could mean missing out on an inheritance, a marriage proposal, or just an update on whether the neighbor's cow had recovered from its cough. Yes, that was a thing. You glance at the little fireplace tucked into the wall, now cold, but once the heart of the place. You picture the first postmaster warming his hands there after trudging through sleet to bring in the morning mailbag. Outside, the landscape hasn't changed much. Rolling hills, stone walls, the occasional startled sheep. But inside, centuries have piled up like layers of dust. Quirky tidbit time. Did you know that in the early days, letters weren't charged by weight or distance, but by the number of sheets? That's why people developed elaborate folding techniques to cram entire messages onto one sheet, turning correspondence into a kind of medieval origami challenge. The postmaster's living quarters upstairs were always modest. You tiptoe up the narrow, twisting staircase, feeling the worn grooves where generations of feet have climbed. Up here, you imagine a small bed, a basin, maybe a cracked mirror. No luxury, but a certain quiet dignity. You wonder how many postmasters lay awake here, counting the days, wondering if the job they inherited or accepted would ever change. Spoiler, it didn't for centuries. Outside, the sign over the door still boasts the royal insignia, a symbol of the post office's official standing. Yet you can't help but smile. For all its official grandeur, most of what passed through here was entirely mundane. Bills, requests, complaints about sheep wandering across property lines. Historians still debate whether the post office's endurance comes from its community value or sheer stubborn continuity. But either way, here it stands. You hear the faintest echo of horses' hooves outside. Though, of course, it's just your imagination. Once, mailbags would have arrived by horseback, the rider shaking off rain, handing over a pouch, perhaps sharing a grim joke about the roads. You can almost feel the damp leather, the cold iron stirrups, the clinking coins paid for postage. If you listen carefully, the post office whispers its history, but not in the dramatic way you might expect. There are no tales of stolen treasure or royal intrigue here, just an endless string of days, one folded letter after another, piling up like quiet snowdrifts. And honestly, that's part of its charm. You let your fingers brush across the rows of old stamps and postcards displayed now for tourists. A tiny glass case holds relics of the past. Antique scales, ink pots, brass letter openers. Somewhere deep inside, you sense the heartbeat of this place. Not loud, not fast, but steady. The heartbeat of waiting, of routine, of messages sent and received, of time crawling gently forward. And as you stand here, under the weight of all that history, you start to feel it. The pull of the long, uneventful journey you're about to follow is not going to be dramatic or flashy, but it's going to wrap you up slowly, like a woolen shawl on a cold night. You step outside, pulling your coat tighter as the Scottish wind bites at your cheeks. You trudge along the narrow village path, the ground soggy underfoot, and you realize mail carriers here didn't just deal with letters and stamps. They fought against the weather itself. Wind lashes across the hills, carrying fine, needling rain that seems to soak you straight to the bones. Imagine doing this every day, twice a day, for years, with nothing but a waxed cloak and sturdy boots. You slip a little on the muddy path and can't help but laugh softly. Yeah, you probably wouldn't last a week. Historians still argue whether the mail carriers in the 1700s were recruited from local farmers or if they were trained professionals, but either way, they needed grit. The routes were long, the hills unforgiving, and the storms relentless. The phrase "through rain, sleet, and snow" wasn't a catchy motto, it was survival. You picture yourself trudging beside one of these early postmen. His face is ruddy from cold, his shoulders hunched. The mailbag at his side is heavy, not because of precious cargo, but because paper back then was thick, heavy stuff. One waterlogged letter could ruin the entire pouch. And oh, the roads, well, roads is generous. Often, they were little more than cart tracks, turning into muddy soup after a storm. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some especially remote regions, when the rivers flooded, the mail carrier didn't wait for the waters to recede. He stripped down, put the mail in a waterproof satchel, and swam across. You're cold just thinking about it, aren't you? The Sanker post office sat at a crossroads, not just of roads, but of lives. Messages from cities like Edinburgh or London would pass through here, heading out to the scattered villages. You close your eyes and imagine a farmer's daughter waiting anxiously for news from a brother in the army, a merchant eager to confirm a shipment of wool, a schoolteacher hoping for a reply from a cousin far away. Of course, not all letters arrived. Historians still debate the percentage of mail lost to storms, theft, or just plain bad luck. What's clear is that when a letter went missing, the consequences could range from minor irritation to absolute heartbreak. You continue walking beside the imagined mail carrier, his boots squelching in the mud, his cloak flapping behind him like a tired flag. The villages are few and far between, and often, the only company on the road is the occasional shaggy Highland cow or an ominously circling raven overhead. The post office itself was often a lifeline, not just for mail but for news. You can almost hear the excited chatter as villagers gathered when the mail arrived. News from the capital, gossip from the next parish, a scrap of a newspaper passed from hand to hand. For isolated communities, these little touches of the outside world mattered more than you can probably imagine. You reach a small stone bridge, its surface slick with moss, and pause. Back then, crossing these bridges in a storm was a gamble. One wrong step and you'd be in the freezing river below. But the mail had to go through. You admire, in a sleepy sort of way, the stubborn persistence it must have taken to do this job day in and day out. The wind picks up again, rattling the bare branches overhead. You picture the mail carriers pressing forward, heads down, pushing through the storm because that was their duty. There was no pause button, no out-of-office reply, no weather delay. Just the long, wet road ahead. And sometimes, despite their best efforts, nature won. Flooded rivers, collapsed roads, snowdrifts taller than a horse. There were days when no amount of determination could overcome the Scottish wilds. Letters were delayed, people waited, and life moved on slowly. You wonder, standing here in the rain, if any of the old mail carriers ever dreamed of quitting, of leaving it all behind. But then again, maybe the routine gave them comfort. The same paths, the same faces, the same letters, day after day, year after year. There's something quietly beautiful in that, isn't there? As you turn back toward the post office, the rain softens for a moment, and you catch the faintest glimmer of sunlight on the hills. You smile. The journey may be long and uneventful, but it's also steady, dependable, like the heartbeat of the post office itself, pulsing softly through the centuries. You find yourself slipping further back in time, imagining the sound of hooves clopping softly over the cobblestones. Horses were once the lifeblood of the postal system, their strong backs carrying leather satchels filled with folded letters, parcels, and the occasional poorly wrapped jar of preserves. You trail behind one now, feeling the jolt of every step through your imaginary saddle. Historians still argue whether the earliest postal riders were government couriers or local farmers hired to fill in when routes became too rugged for regular travelers. Either way, you can picture them, perched on shaggy ponies, navigating the twisting Scottish hills, trying not to spill the post into the mud. You pause at a river's edge. Back then, crossing meant one of two things: using a tiny wooden boat that looked questionably seaworthy or trusting your horse to wade through. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive one of those crossings without at least losing a boot. The idea of waterproof packaging? That was called hoping for the best. Quirky tidbit. In especially boggy areas, some postal routes included planks or stepping stones laid out across the marsh. Imagine balancing carefully, one foot after another, a heavy mailbag tugging at your shoulder, trying not to think about the squelching mud just inches away. You smile sleepily at the thought. It's like a postal tightrope act, centuries before modern pavement. You walk alongside the imagined rider as he pulls up at an inn for the night. The post couldn't always move non-stop. Sometimes, it needed to rest, just like its carrier. Inns became unofficial postal hubs, where letters were sorted, warmed by a crackling fire, and sometimes read aloud. Privacy standards were, let's just say, relaxed. You listened to the murmured gossip over tankards of ale, imagining how much of the local news was passed along by half-bored postal workers. Historians still debate how much trust was placed in these early mail carriers. Were they seen as noble civil servants or nosy messengers poking into everyone's business? The truth was probably somewhere in between. But one thing's clear. They were vital to keeping rural communities connected, even if most of the letters they carried were about things like shipments, marriage arrangements, and yes, the occasional complaint about a neighbor's wandering pigs. You chuckle softly, thinking about the sheer mundanity of so much of this mail. People sometimes imagine old letters as grand declarations or life-changing news, but most were just everyday stuff. Please send more seeds. The roof needs fixing. I'll visit after the harvest. Yet it's exactly this ordinariness that feels comforting now. As you walk the old routes in your mind, your steps take you to a rocky stretch of road, the kind that would have been especially punishing on a horse's hooves. Early postal routes often depended on the durability of the animals as much as the riders. A thrown shoe or a lame leg could delay the mail by days. You glance at your own modern shoes and think, wow, we really take sneakers for granted. As you near another river crossing, you remember that, over time, some routes introduced ferries to carry mail across wider waters. Imagine the careful loading of the mailbags, the creaking of the wooden boat, the nervous glances at the dark, swirling current below. If the river was too wild, well, sorry, your letter about next Sunday's dinner plans was going to be late. You hear the faint echo of hooves again, blending with the sound of water and wind. The journey wasn't just about delivering mail. It was about proving that communication could stretch across even the most stubborn terrain. And while it may have been slow, it was steady, reliable. There's a sleepy comfort in that kind of persistence, isn't there? You reach an imagined village, its cottages low and thatched, smoke curling gently from chimneys. The post rider dismounts, legs stiff, stretching with a groan. You watch as the letters are handed over, one by one, into eager or indifferent hands. Some villagers light up at the sight of a long-awaited message. Others barely glance before pocketing the envelope. That mix of excitement and routine, of grand hopes and small disappointments, feels timeless, stretching across the centuries to today. As you turn back toward the post office, you realize how much depended on the bodies and spirits of these mail carriers and their horses. Every soggy field, every muddy boot, every narrow bridge crossed under moonlight, each was a small victory in the long, uneventful march of history. And with that, you pull your cloak a little tighter, listening to the soft sounds of hoofbeats fading into the night. You wander further along the old postal routes, stepping into the kinds of hidden villages where the mail arrived maybe once a week, if the weather behaved. These weren't the bustling towns on maps or main roads. These were clusters of stone cottages tucked into valleys, surrounded by fields of sheep, where life moved to its own slow rhythm. You duck under a low stone arch, imagining the village postman entering the square, his arrival barely causing a stir. Historians still argue whether these isolated hamlets truly relied on outside mail or if they mainly functioned on word of mouth and neighborly visits. But when the mail did come, it was always an event, small, perhaps, but meaningful. You picture yourself walking beside the postman, his boots caked in mud, his cap pulled low against the drizzle. He carries a satchel filled with folded letters, most of them small, some sealed with wax, others clumsily tied with string. Maybe one's addressed to the local blacksmith, another to the schoolmaster, and a third to a woman who's been waiting anxiously for news from her son working miles away. Quirky tidbit. In some especially remote Scottish villages, residents used to leave outgoing mail in hollowed-out tree trunks along the path, trusting the mail carrier to check the spot. Imagine the trust it took to just stuff a letter into a tree and hope it got picked up. You glance sideways at a gnarled old oak and wonder how many secrets those trees once held. As you weave through the village, you notice the tiny details. The crumbling stone walls, the peat smoke curling from chimneys, the chickens scratching in the dirt. You pass by a cluster of villagers, their faces weathered, their hands busy with farm tools, barely glancing up as the mail arrives. Maybe they know there's nothing exciting in today's delivery. Just a bill, a notice, a request for help fixing a roof. Historians still debate how much these isolated communities depended on the post for news of the outside world. Some argue that rural villages were surprisingly self-contained, their main news carried by travelers or peddlers, not letters. Others insist that the mail played a vital role in keeping even the smallest hamlets connected to national events. What's clear is that when letters did come, they carried a weight beyond just words. They were lifelines. You sit on a low stone wall, listening to the soft sounds of the village. A dog barking in the distance, a baby crying, the rhythmic thump of a hammer at the smithy. You picture the postman knocking gently on doors, handing over folded sheets of paper, exchanging a few words. Maybe he shares a local rumor or a scrap of news from the town over the hill. Sometimes, the postman didn't even bother with the formal delivery. He left letters at the local inn or tavern, trusting the villagers to come collect their mail. And you smile, thinking how that probably led to a lot of, "Oh, I meant to pick it up last week," excuses. Some things you realize never change. You follow the mail carrier down a narrow path, his lantern swinging in the dusk. These were not glamorous routes, and there were no grand rewards waiting at the end. But there was a kind of quiet honor in serving these tucked-away places, in being the thread that tied them, however loosely, to the wider world. You pause at the edge of the village, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The mail has been delivered, the day's work is done, and the postman begins his long walk back. You imagine the sound of his boots crunching on gravel, the creak of the mailbag's strap, the occasional sniffle in the cold air. You glance up at the stars just beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, the same stars were watched by postmen a century ago, making the same journey across the hills, carrying the same kinds of messages. And it hits you in a soft, lulling way. This story isn't about one big, dramatic moment. It's about small, steady acts, repeated over and over, until they become part of the landscape itself. So you tuck your hands into your pockets, let out a long breath, and begin following the postman's path back into the night, ready to see what tomorrow's deliveries will bring. You find yourself inside the post office once more, but this time, you're leaning over a wooden counter, sorting through a stack of old letters. Their rough parchment crackles softly under your fingertips, and as you unfold one, you realize it's about turnip prices. Yep, turnips. You let out a slow, amused sigh. This is the stuff people waited weeks to hear about. Historians still argue whether these kinds of letters, mundane, practical, everyday messages, outnumbered the dramatic or romantic ones we love to imagine. Sure, there were love letters and political intrigue, but the bulk of the post? Purely functional. Messages about harvest yields, requests for supplies, invoices, debts, weather updates, and endless family logistics. You shuffle through the stack. Here's one from a merchant in Edinburgh, complaining about a delayed shipment. Another from a landowner asking when the new roof tiles will arrive. A third is just a single line. The hens are not laying. Advise. You can't help but laugh softly. Somehow, it's comforting to know that even centuries ago, people were grumbling about the small stuff. Quirky tidbit. Some people used letters as a form of negotiation, writing in roundabout, polite language to ask for favors or dodge responsibility. Imagine waiting 2 weeks for a letter only to read, "I might consider your proposal if circumstances permit," when all you wanted was a yes or no. Talk about slow-burn frustration. You let your gaze drift over the mailroom. The postmaster leans on the counter, sipping something warm, eyes half-lidded. The assistant picks through the bundles, separating local from long-distance mail. Outside, the village moves at its usual pace, with no sense of urgency. Life here is measured not in minutes or hours, but in days, in the steady beat of letters arriving and departing. Historians still debate whether these slow rhythms were a source of frustration or reassurance for people back then. On one hand, you had to wait ages for any kind of reply. On the other, the very slowness might have made news feel more deliberate, more thoughtful, more precious. After all, no one dashed off a careless letter when parchment cost so much and delivery took weeks. You step into the sorting area, where shelves are crammed with pigeonholes labeled for nearby villages and distant cities. You trail your fingers over the labels, feeling the rough wood, imagining the careful system behind all this. It's surprisingly calming, almost like a physical manifestation of patience. You can almost hear the scratch of a quill pen, the rustle of parchment, the quiet clink of sealing wax cooling on a letter. There's a softness to it all, a kind of sleepy repetition. You wonder what it would have felt like to work here day after day, sorting the same names, recognizing familiar handwriting, knowing that most of these letters would arrive and change very little. You slip back outside for a breath of air. The clouds hang low, the grass glistens with rain, and the world feels suspended in time. You think about all the lives connected by these humble letters. The farmers, merchants, housekeepers, and school teachers whose voices, captured in ink, drifted from hand to hand. You find yourself smiling again at the thought that most of these letters weren't about big, history-shaping events. They were about chickens, crops, and weather, about small debts and smaller victories, about promises kept, delayed, or gently forgotten. In the grand scheme of things, they didn't change the world, but they mattered deeply to the people sending and receiving them. As you walk slowly back toward the post office, you notice how the building seems to settle into its surroundings, as if it belongs here in the same way the hills and the stones and the sky belong. It's not grand, not dramatic, but it's steady. And sometimes you realize that's enough. You picture the last letter of the day sliding into its pigeonhole, the postmaster yawning, the lamp burning low. Outside, the wind picks up, and the village tucks itself in for the night. And you let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of centuries of small, uneventful letters, carrying quiet, uneventful news that nonetheless kept this little corner of the world gently connected. You rub your fingers together, feeling the faint stickiness of old wax seals in your imagination. Back then, every letter wasn't just a folded piece of paper. It was an event, sealed carefully with colored wax, pressed with a signet ring or a carved stamp. You gently close your eyes, picturing yourself fumbling with one now, the wax cracking slightly as you peel it open, hoping you don't tear the contents inside. Outside the post office, you spot movement, a flash of black feathers. Crows. You squint. Quirky tidbit. In rural Scotland, local folklore sometimes painted crows as clever little thieves, known to snatch small items, including the occasional shiny wax seal, if left unattended. Imagine the sheer annoyance of having your precious letter intercepted by a beady-eyed bird with a taste for drama. Historians still argue whether theft and interception were genuine risks in these early postal networks or if the stories were exaggerated. Highwaymen and mail robbers did exist, certainly, but most letters weren't exactly worth a daring heist. After all, how many criminals wanted to risk hanging for a note about someone's overdue sheep shearing? Still, the idea of intercepted mail, stolen or tampered with, adds a little tingle of tension to this otherwise sleepy journey. You duck back inside the post office, warming your hands by the memory of an old fire. You picture the postmaster and his assistant working late, sorting through the mail by candlelight. You can almost hear the scratch of a knife as they trim the edges of envelopes, the gentle hiss of wax as it's melted for sealing, the occasional curse when a seal bubbles or drips the wrong way. Handling the mail was a delicate ritual. Not rushed, not careless. Every letter mattered, even if its content was boring or predictable. A wrongly delivered letter could cause confusion. A missing one could spark real consequences. You imagine the postmaster gently tapping each wax seal, checking that it's intact, carefully arranging bundles for delivery. Outside, the night deepens. You step back into the cold, imagining the peril of the road ahead. It wasn't just the weather or the terrain. There were human dangers too. Lonely paths where robbers might lurk, hoping for a stray coin or a valuable parcel. You wrap your coat tighter, feeling the chill run down your spine. But let's be honest, not every letter was a treasure. You can almost hear a tired mail carrier muttering to himself, "Oh great, another batch of complaints about missing fence posts." Still, the mail had to go through, rain or shine, risk or no risk. The system depended on trust, on reliability, on the slow, steady passing of sealed messages from hand to hand. You find yourself walking along the old delivery route, lantern in hand, boots crunching on frost. You imagine passing by farms, cottages, the occasional wary face peeking out of a window. Most of the time, the danger wasn't bandits or thieves. It was the endlessness of the road, the loneliness, the sheer repetition. Historians still debate whether the early postmasters were chosen for their loyalty, their local status, or simply their willingness to do a tedious job. Whatever the reason, they became fixtures in their communities, known and trusted, even if their work went largely unnoticed. You smile softly, realizing how many unsung, steady hands kept this old system running. As you circle back toward the post office, the night is hushed, the stars bright above. You let your fingers drift once more over the imagined wax seals, the rough parchment, the delicate strings tying everything together. It's not flashy, it's not grand, but it's steady. A rhythm of trust, caution, and care that carried countless ordinary lives forward, one sealed letter at a time. And so, you slip inside once more, the door creaking softly behind you, and settle in by the memory of that old, flickering hearth, ready to follow the next stretch of this long, uneventful journey. You find yourself seated on a wobbly wooden stool behind the counter, elbows resting on the scratched surface, staring at the neat rows of pigeonholes along the wall. Each slot brims with folded letters, some tied in bundles, others marked carefully with destinations. You shift your weight slightly, the stool creaks, as if it's been doing this for centuries, and you realize you're now inside the rhythm of the mailroom. There's something almost hypnotic about the sorting process. You picture your hands moving automatically. Pluck a letter, check the address, place it in the right slot, over and over. It's oddly soothing, in the same way repetitive chores can sometimes be. There's no rush, no dramatic deadline, just the steady hum of routine. Historians still argue whether early post offices like this one were purely functional spaces or if they doubled as community hubs. After all, people weren't just here to drop off letters. They were here to gossip, swap news, sometimes even lodge complaints. You imagine the postmaster nodding politely while a farmer grumbles about delayed mail or a missing parcel, secretly counting the minutes until closing time. Quirky tidbit: mail sorting wasn't always done behind closed doors. In some places, postmasters did the work right in front of customers, who were often way too curious about whose letter had arrived and from where. You grin sleepily, imagining nosy villagers craning their necks, whispering behind gloved hands. "Did you see that one for Mrs. McAllister? Wonder what that's about." You glance down at the sorting bench. A worn surface scattered with tools of the trade, scales for weighing parcels, a pot of ink for marking, sealing wax, and perhaps an old, battered ledger where every incoming and outgoing item was carefully recorded. You run a fingertip along the imaginary edge, feeling the grooves worn by generations of postal workers. As you continue the routine in your mind, you can't help but wonder what it must have felt like to handle so many lives, so many tiny fragments of people's stories, without ever really knowing the full picture. A letter to a merchant, a note to a soldier, a parcel for a widow. You were just the hand in between, the quiet bridge between sender and receiver. You look up at the clock ticking softly on the wall. The hours pass slowly here, the day punctuated only by the arrival of the next batch of mail. Outside, the sky darkens, and you imagine the soft glow of lanterns flickering into life. Inside, the postmaster ties up the last bundle, glances over the ledger one final time, and lets out a long, satisfied sigh. Another day, another set of letters sent and received. The world kept gently spinning by the small, deliberate rituals of this quiet room. Historians still debate how much pride these early postmasters took in their work. Was it just a job, or did they feel a real sense of responsibility, of purpose? You like to think it was both. The satisfaction of knowing they were part of something bigger, even if the individual tasks were small and repetitive. You glance at the locked cabinet in the corner, where valuable parcels were kept safe overnight. Maybe a watch or a bit of jewelry or some coins waiting to be collected. You wonder how often the postmaster sat here late at night, sipping tea by the fire, listening to the wind whistle outside, feeling the weight of the trust placed in his hands. The sorting bench, the pigeonholes, the ledger, they were more than just tools. They were symbols of reliability, of the quiet, stubborn persistence that kept the postal system moving through centuries of storms, wars, and slow change. You let out a soft breath, letting the imagined weight of the mailroom settle over you. Outside, the hills darken, the stars blink awake, and the post office slips into its nightly hush. You close your eyes briefly, feeling the slow, patient pulse of the place, knowing that tomorrow, the rituals will begin all over again. Steady, uneventful, and quietly essential.